Hello everyone, today we talk about the infantry autonomy in Western European warfare between the 12th and 13th century, not narrowly meant in chronological boundaries within which we can space, but rather in specific examples. This is, again, like most of my content, just randomly coming up on the basis of course, of other stuff we already said and we normally discuss. But for example, yesterday we talked about the role of the English longbowmen in the tactics of the 100 Years' War. It's not connected, if not, because of course you chose to follow a channel that deals mostly with medieval warfare and art of war. This topic is particularly important for a number of reasons. As you know, I have some sort of soft spot for this specific theme that is specifically combined arms tactics and how cavalry and infantry normally operated on the medieval battlefields. I would say on a regular basis, because at the end of the day, you just have two arms, right? Cavalry and infantry, and that's where basically everything gets down to. In terms of possible combinations and interaction. The history of cavalry and infantry cooperation is fairly complex, at least if you descend in its details, but at the same time, if you look at the medieval era, chronologically wise, there are some important ups and downs that nevertheless reflect at least what one should recognize as the major political and social issues going on during this millennium that are, again, in fact, reflected in turn in the same warfare and tactics. Now, why is this topic important, by the way? Because we'll just today look at a bunch of examples to essentially picture well what we're discussing in a broader sense, and for the sake of appreciating how, first of all, logical, like the type of cavalry and infantry interaction is, but how also relatively not much unmysterious, really, because there are so many things that we do not know openly stated by the sources, unfortunately. However, how sort of even in this absconded historical reality, remain essentially tied to military logic, to simplicity, to cohesion, to unity of command, and do not, in fact, take many tangents, as sometimes, like, say, I can't say, for example, the bigger channels tend to do, because overall, like, at least by this point, the information that they provide is basically correct. But there is, at the same time, like, while an important attention to certain aspects that, of course, can be told in different ways, normally smaller videos than these ones, they do not take into consideration the whole art of war per se. Like, I tried also in the last weeks to look at different videos from channels like, I don't know, Kings and Generals, Saint Roman History, you name them, right? And they overall, again, learn how to do their stuff well. There is a constant improvement if you make so many videos at a time, whichever your background is. And it's not much that what they say is not correct, but there is an overall approach that mostly narrows things down to either a certain particular part of the Middle Ages, like the Middle Ages, 14th, 15th century warfare. That's sort of a disappointing approach in many ways. Just certain regions of Europe. They can be literally two countries. And also in that, not much of a diachronic or comparative perspective. It is to say, for example, what were these armies about throughout these centuries, right? That's an approach that, and how did they change, really, right? The approach normally is, let's narrow it down to the basics, so to more or less understand how, in fact, to found those very bases that I also give somehow for granted when I make these videos. When cavalry, for example, was fully decisive on the battlefield, when infantry sort of went up and down, etc. But in a sense, as in these changes, and also the subtler ones throughout the generations, not identifying, in fact, very important passages that would be crucial to appreciate more even that broader substance, right? Because if you have to memorize, it's just like when you learn history in general. There are a few major events, right? When you start learning history that you have to memorize and to maintain as bit as your point of reference. Then you have an image of that, and then when you get a bit more in depth to them, you realize, you start seeing how truly important and why they are important in a much better way. But you also are able to contextualize them into some broader picture. You get sort of the secondary but still very important aspects that really constitute them, etc. And this is mostly what we do on Schwerpunkt, right? A much more sort of in-depth focus on some aspects that must be both theoretical and practical at the same time. Because you may also look at these examples and make the point that, they all constitute what eventually happened, but you must also be able to read in some overarching fashion the main changes and why they really happen. And there are, in fact, different ways to do so as well. The autonomy of infantry in the medieval art of war is important because of the subsidiary auxiliary supporting role that it had to cavalry, especially at this point. We were talking about the 13th century. We're really at the peak of cavalry power, right? That is essentially the only full century where in Western Europe cavalry was basically hegemonic, but where infantry did not achieve victories over cavalry, while still being, as a whole, on average, inferior to cavalry. This is actually something that happens, more often than we think. Like, we have an idea like cavalry dominated for completely European battlefields for centuries and centuries. It actually lasted a few if we take into account in fact, that up to the mid-12th century, there are isolated cases in which cavalry is basically stopped, right, halted, even though it was, again, the stronger arm of the two. Also, we sort of overly emphasize the early 14th century infantry victories that are objectively very important, more important than, in fact, the one of the previous centuries, but that are overemphasized, at least in the sense that they are often understood up from this time onwards, like basically to pike and square warfare is just a linear increase in infantry power. Instead, it's really not, right? There is a big hole lasting a century, like between the mid-14th and the mid-15th century, where infantry kept remaining subordinated to cavalry, even properly lost ground compared to the first half of the 14th century. And in explaining these relations, sometimes people skip also how infantry and cavalry were normally operating in the history of warfare that, in this sense, can be understood like throughout all the ancient and the medieval eras. Infantry was not mere during the Middle Ages, even when it was under the full might of cavalry, aside from the fact that there was an absolute growth, not just a relative one, so that we explained how, for example, in the peak of for example, of cavalry warfare in the 13th century, actually infantry peaked in actual quality, and or at least especially up to the early 14th century as well. All right, but in all this, these arms were never sort of unwieldy, passive, relegated to a merely, even infantry at some point, defensive functions. Infantry was quite active, was quite autonomous, and it had to be so simply for the fact that it regularly fought in tandem with cavalry. All right, combined arms tactics contemplated for cavalry and infantry to constantly cooperate. Right, this is true especially in sanitary warfare. In say, for example, Central Asian warfare. Think about the Seljuks, etc. That, however, when arriving in a sanitary war, did use infantry themselves. You have, if anything, the combination instead of heavy cavalry and light cavalry. So it's a different thing. Here, there is also the subsection of infantry and cavalry, at least not for the sanitary war more than much. A bit there was, like mounted crossbowmen, but especially between melee and missile troops, right? That also shouldn't be overly emphasized. Missile troops, especially, as I was saying yesterday, because of the long bowman thing, it gets often sort of overstated. But missile troops are subordinated to heavy infantry, that is not heavy in the sense of how much it ways, or what kind of armament it properly, or the kind of armoredness, if anything, that it has, but simply that has something to do with that, but that is calculated in relative terms to those who can stand their ground and those who can't, right? Also because this aligns with cavalry as well. There is skirmishing cavalry. That can ideally, stand its ground against cavalry, and it does happen. We'll see some aspect of that, or even counterattacking in overwhelming cavalry in certain circumstances that, however, are not quite the norm, because at this point there is no really, like between the 13th, the second half of the 12th century, any real infantry victory. Like there are, as we'll see now, victories that owed much to the infantry, but that were never quite fully infantry victories over cavalry, as infantry alone, right? Cavalry was always in support, and it was basically with this shock power the decisive arm. Essentially the missile troops were relegated to an auxiliary role of the heavy infantry one. They also operated in combined arms with those, but were more like a broader support, like some kind of background noise to an extent, to sort of render things more difficult to the opponents, but not being this quite radically impacting element, unless we look at specific, again, circumstances and when this combined arm tactics were really very perfection. This is not to say that crossbow or simple bow fire were not something to be feared. As a matter of fact, the West taught something to the East that is commonly thought to be, archery all around. They had the strongest missile component. Actually, Westerners in this period are hired also by the Mongols as mercenaries for their crossbowmen and more, right? So there is overall, like always, a contextualization you have to make of these arms within the military system of reference, and in this sense also the specific civilization of reference. I mean, it's not a random occurrence that the Mongols literally stopped in Central Europe, right? Even though they had political reasons that had nothing to do with the war to come back to Mongolia. The fact of just coping with, first of all, not just they had defeated peoples in open field, but had not quite tamed. It's not like the Poles or the Hungarians were conquered, like even if they had been defeated in open field. Germany and Italy start becoming really too much of a tough nut to crack, without mentioning that there was all the rest of Western Europe involved. And so we tend to often confuse different levels, like politics, strategy, tactics, and these are all happening, in fact, in different dimensions that, although intertwining, must always be reconciled, right? There are people who skip from literally, using this weapon to be a successful civilization, and of course, in between, there is actually much more in a specific logic that, even from a strictly military point of view, from strategy to tactics, you must be able to properly visualize. This is for saying that infantry actually had a much greater autonomy and versatility than we I wouldn't say necessarily tend to think, because I presume that especially my followers are pretty aware of this stuff, but that I think we tend, for historiographical reasons proper, not to appreciate in its operational fluidity, so to say. I mean, for example, being able to constantly follow cavalry on the field, right? And for example, being constantly aligned with the main battle lines, supporting the charges, being capable, in fact, of inserting here the complication of missile and heavy infantry, etc., being able to close on the enemy wings and simply maneuvering to be able to do something. For example, wheeling, right? These were all things that these infantries had, and displaying, actually, whenever we have the luck for these centuries to have some discrete information about these actions in what are apparently flawless ways, right? It never occurred to me when studying medieval warfare at some point there was, I don't know, a unit that was incapable to perform its sort of these basic tasks. There was an army that didn't know what it was doing, right? That were completely uncoordinated, that basically jammed as a system. This is true also for the ancient world. This is true for a consistent, right? This is true also for today, even like this in the simplistic way. Sometimes we criticize certain armored forces. We don't realize the actual complexity of strategy, of operational, tactical readiness, etc. That is also what the military constantly trains for, and that in general, in fact, gets into, especially in times like this when we don't really have like a contemporary state, right, that is able to control everything and everyone, just out of the sheer practice experience, like the fact that these troops were regularly getting, into, beating the business of beating each other, and as a consequence being organized for that, mainly. As I was saying before, we may also tend to overstate the adversity, the antagonism, so to say, between cavalry and infantry. This did happen at some point, but it's a political or social rivalry in some circumstances that in certain cases even toughen up the cooperation between cavalry and infantry. As I was hinting at before, there are some regions of Europe where, for example, infantry was stronger than in the places where infantry was able to beat cavalry, for example. And this can be easily understood, for example, by the fact that in the First World, you would have essentially a regular abundance, a political and social integration, like in city-states, etc., of cavalry and infantry, where you have the best coordination to municipal pride, to the regular wars against a city or another. In some sort of frontier areas, some sort of at least decentralized ones, for different reasons, like you can have, I don't know, the rough Scottish lowlanders to the affluent Flemish bourgeois, right? But you have, for a reason or another, a weaker feudal authority, right? It's sometimes, again, distance from the center, sometimes poverty. And in that case, infantry will, in relative terms, in this system, have the upper hand, and in this sense, be able to surpass even cavalry. If I would think the liminal example is the Battle of Courtrai. The Battle of Courtrai is really amazing. It also proves that basically the Flemish military system went nowhere after that battle. It's not like there was a military revolution starting from there. Flemish armies would be later particularly performing. On the contrary, they would constantly be beaten after Mont-Pavel a few years later by the Franco-Burgundian feudal knightly armies on horseback until the end of the Middle Ages. But in that sense, you have essentially a frontier area from the Kingdom of France, a very strong autonomistic sentiment from the side of the Flemish. Also, as we'll see now, very underappreciated aspect, that is to say the fact that knights normally were behind basically any infantry victory, as if anything, as if not as proper bodies, as we'll see now, of cavalry. Say, you can argue that, I don't know, Flemish armies were at that point made up just of infantry, and that's why we account them as infantry victories only. The same can be said even when there actually was some consistent cavalry element, but it was so small compared to the infantry one, like in Scotland, that at the end of the day, that wasn't even much of a reason to reason in combined armed tactics. And so you have at some point just the brutal resolve of these peoples that for a reason or another were fighting either for independence, or sometimes there are accidents along the way, as we will see now. And that bring to these infantry victories that, although and very rightly acclaimed, did not actually leave during the 14th century that trail of military reform or stepping up of infantry quality that we think, especially with Black Death, these infantry victories seize all of the sudden. Even though they had been flourishing, and this was actually not much progress. Rather, the fact that those infantry, say the commoners, the peasants that had expressed those infantries, were starting to feel the beginning of the 14th century with increasing pressure, a bit of a stagnating economy, just the heat, right, the pressure of other authorities that eventually would be able to finally subjugate them, right? In most cases, they actually destroyed themselves in the process, as we've seen, for example, in Flanders is sort of the most typical example. But knights were normal advisors to these people, because it's not like the Flemish bourgeois with the Godendag was simply, or the Gewindestaaf, as it was more properly called, was simply a professional soldier, could know where to line up, how to stand his ground, etc., without the guidance. In the example of knights who got themselves killed from the House of Dampierre, the Counts of Flanders, in the very front ranks of the Flemish phalanx on foot, right? So we have, actually, if you study the sources of the era, you realize that nobody was interpreting this as a sort of class struggle, because at the end of the day, it's easy from a structuralistic or postmodernistic perspective, classistic one, to presume that, the commoner is just the guy, the artisan, and the knight is just, the nobleman that leaves off somebody else's work. When you study the actual eventual history of this all, you realize it was a clash between vertical powers, essentially, and that constantly fought with cavalry and infantry alike, right? There's never been an element in medieval warfare that knew how effective, how dangerous also the potential of infantry really was than knights, right? This other myth, other knights are a bunch of son of bitches that hated everybody other than themselves, and that at some point were beaten down by these commoners that they didn't think were capable of doing that. Well, of course, they didn't expect that to happen, but it's not like when they wouldn't wish that to themselves. But when they were taking the field, they knew pretty darn well what those infantry forces were actually capable of doing. And regarding this, it's in fact incredibly important to appreciate how most of the European communities were constantly operating with cavalry and infantry alike, for also this kind of a position between the two arms not being a real thing, and or if anything, actually a mean of further development of synergy, of combined armed tactics. And in fact, it's sort of weird, and I always pointed out that historiography not just celebrated, let's say, this early 14th century infantry victories, mostly for the sake of essentially depicting the modern age as a moment in which people went up for some reason, which was actually the other way around in relative terms, especially to the nobility. But that they skipped, in the sense, the fact that these tactics were not anything particularly nor innovative nor particularly developed. They actually were quite primitive. Fighting without cavalry is not a good thing, even for infantry, right? And there were actually, in fact, stronger infantries around that also performed things that these other infantries were absolutely not capable of doing, or at least, in theory they could have done it, but they weren't properly in the context for being able to do it, even just from, for example, in terms of spending. And that has sort of oriented the studying of the art of war towards directions that are frankly disappointing. And today, I presume there is an important amount of works dedicated to battles, campaigns, etc. But sometimes even the very experts remain within the story of that battle without knowing that there were so many other battles that were knowing that, of course, many other battles were being fought, but never having had the great interest in actually realizing that there is some comparison to do between them to understand how normally Europeans in general fought at the time, right? I'm not going to make any name because I have one very specific name inside for about a battle that I just discussed. But again, sometimes the public is confused between, say, okay, but that is an expert, he's a great historian. Yes, but being an expert in the art of war specifically is a different thing, right? You can be a great historian, you may have researched so much and whatever, but if you have never actually studied multiple battles at a time, campaigns, have some broader, say, decade of experience in the field, you can tell the story, but you may not even critically analyze the thing. I'm very critical towards some historians that nominally would actually do this, but that in practice are incredibly lazy also in the way they analyze these battles and constantly forget that there is a whole continent to look at, and not just saying, let's look at the extremes. No, let's remain just within Western Europe and let's realize how much there is that hasn't actually even been touched. And I'm not kidding, right? I'm not kidding. You can, again, have a battle that everybody knows about, that has been written about, but it has not been tactically reconstructed on the actual critical analysis of sources for that specific sake of reconstructing combat, how the battle was fought. And I'm not kidding. This is actually the current mainstay of the situation. All right. But passing to some example, also of some eras that in fact did not here overly perform in terms of civilizational development, but that were quite warlike, and actually for some reason that I explained in the videos about their relative regions, in fact, histories, did provide with strong forces. We're talking especially the northwestern part of the German kingdom, all right, and what actually today you mostly call the Netherlands, all right. There are some very famous examples. Today I'm going just to notionally sort of revise them, right? But we will talk about the single battles that are really very, very important. And some of these, again, are also relatively famous because, again, something has been written more about them. There are much bigger ones that nobody has practically ever written about, and that would actually make a much better comparative example. We are in 1288, as Duke John I of Brabant spearheaded a direct assault alongside his allies at Veringen. Right? The Battle of Veringen is very famous, mostly for the power that infantry displayed. And the peasants from the county of Berg, together with the communal militia of Cologne, I just recently made a video about the German archbishopric, like the elector princes, ecclesiastical electors of the empire, moved to strike the flank of the Prince Bishop of Cologne's forces. Right, their attack on this flank in the enemy's rear was pivotal in shaping the battle's result. Because they won. Not simply with that, because there were different divisions of the line, and so different things were happening here and there. It's a bit like, I don't know, at Bouvines, there is one section where there is a flank attack and another where something else is happening. So this is also kind of relatively normal, but here there is an asymmetry that allows infantry, and untypically, at least because these are exceptions, right? This infantry, this victory is not achieved by infantry, by this specific maneuver, right? We are also uncertain whether this tactical decision was devised by the Count of Berg or the battle's overall leader, the Count of Wernenburg. In any case, we see what we were saying before, that is, these forces were under specifically nobiliar leaders that basically gave the order and or basically enacted these tactics as the situation was feasible. Again, finding an enemy for differences. Today, we don't even get into the specifics of the Battle of Veringen because we would understand. Sometimes we don't even understand how the attack happened, but overall, we understand that this was just a situation where they found the enemy without protection in front of them in attack, but it wasn't necessarily something they pre-planned, right? Or that they could simply enact at every single moment of the battle. And this depends very much on the spaces, on like how you reconstruct the battle itself. That is relatively simple because the sources do not tell too much. But this is a case, at least, in which we see that infantry is obviously capable of attacking. This is the broader notion. There's never a moment in medieval warfare in which infantry is mere, because this is said very often, like infantry just had this passive capacity, right? Sit there and they took the charges. Yes, if they were being charged, because it would be foolish to do otherwise. You had to be very firm, very fixed, very thickly compact, very cohesive. But the capacity of advancing, of moving, of attacking was always there, right? The fact that infantry at large does not do this essentially until the Swiss in the mid-15th century, because in fact also the infantry only victories of the early 14th centuries are not they're basically always in defense. There are some counterattacks when cavalry has already been stopped in defense. It's just that, but basically the ability of simply venturing out there in open field to catch by surprise the enemy and attacking him like the Swiss really do, by the way, risking enormously. Also because they operated just with infantry, which, as we've seen, is not ideal. In fact, the Swiss wouldn't really remain in charge for long, right? Especially as fully pike and shot combined armed tactics were devised. This is something in the Middle Ages you don't have, but you don't have to confuse it with the fact that infantry wouldn't be able to advance. Otherwise, how could you have infantry? It's not like they lined up just in the place where they would have to stand their ground. As we said, they moved pretty freely. And we'll see now also some clamorous examples that really tell you in how, especially in certain areas of Europe, infantry was really powerful. So what you see at Veringen, maybe because there are some areas of Europe that again are a bit more effervescent, right? Brabant, this area from which, for example, in the previous centuries, also lots of mercenaries of infantrymen, the Brabançons, also some pretty scumbag route here of some sort, very often heretical, and definitely also there with some classistic, anti-clerical, anti-nobiliar bias, but still, like most of the times, actually framed under nobiliar rule. Had originated. So it's not like Veringen is a random place, right? You don't see, this is basically also the only place, the only circumstance in which basically in Germany you have like an infantry victory worth of this name. Like if you take, up to the mid-12th century, even royal imperial armies in Germany had dismounted, right? Also considering that Germany was not fully colonized, like there was still full of forests or swamps, etc. So that's absolutely normal. And as we said, up to the mid-12th century, also in the rest of Western Europe, we made lots of videos. For example, the Battle of Burgtherold. It was a bit also for the same cavalry to dismount and fight as infantry, together with other proper infantry troops, and not just in sieges, but talking open field confrontations. And so this is, for example, the only remark. I made a video about the Dittmarscher, for example, that especially in later times achieved something more in terms of infantry. And that's more like the aforementioned case of an area that was very scarcely stratified from a social point of view, and so where the counts of Holstein could at some point actually control this population, other times really failing, but also because of good exploitation of terrain, right? One thing is really meeting an enemy in open field, even maybe behind a stream or a canal, whatever, that's a thing, but especially as a large formation that really is mashed into by enemy cavalry. One thing is sort of blockading a point of passage or maybe ambushing an enemy. That's quite a different thing, right? So what you see at Veringen with the German infantry is basically like the minimum that in that juicy circumstance, like this infantry could do, like attacking on, falling on an enemy flank, which is at the end of the day what you like. It's a devastating thing psychologically speaking, and putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority because of this asymmetrical attack, which at the end of the day warfare always points to. And that's, again, a very interesting scenario also because the Flemish really had some interesting experience with rebellions against feudal power that was in crisis, especially during the 13th century. So there are cases in which smaller engagements really that were even in towns, etc., where knights were butchered and stuff. Like they're not big glamorous things, but there is really something there, and we will talk a bit more about this later. Other area where this stuff basically manifests more or less towards the end of the 13th century, I made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge. That is not an infantry victory, by the way, but it just shows how the Scottish were potentially very, very good, because there had just been actually an English victory that would exterminate, Scottish infantry. So actually, don't even think that this is something like, there is a gradual deterministic increase in this infantry capacity, and the single battle is simply decided by that. Absolutely not. This has to do with the contingent, tactic, command, again, morale, plan, whatever. So you can find, as it often happens, that these infantry victories are sometimes literally seen as a miracle by the sources of the time, and in fact are not even reading in these episodes other than something particularly annoying, like a world upside down. Like a world is changing just because of that, or cavalry now is not in charge. Absolutely not. You can imagine that medieval Europe resting pretty firmly on the notion that, of course, knights were dominant and that cavalry was in the same way. All right. But Scotland is also a very interesting place, again, in the Celtic fringe, so it's relatively each example is really unique considering the circumstances. Before we looked at Brabant, that, as we've seen, was historically quite aggressive and warlike, and could affirm as the most powerful force in Flanders, because of the particular political fragmentation of the area and essentially the fringe area compared, especially to where the German centers of monarchic power during, by the way, the disgregation of national monarchy were shifting mostly towards the east. All right. We talked about this also in the recent video about the German archbishoprics, because these clashes are taking place, as we've seen here, with the Bishop of Cologne, exactly in those contexts, right? There isn't a strong central power in northwestern Germany at any of this point. So Scotland is another thing. Scotland is barely a feudal country. It's something that will fully become so only during the wars of Scottish independence. So we're at the beginning of that period. And by then, in the armies of the Scottish kings, foot soldiers often operated with autonomy, giving the limited number of knights compared to the English king's forces. I made a video a couple of years ago about the Battle of Largs that illustrates the modus operandi against there, mostly from the Norwegian sources that were landing in on the western Scottish seaboard and were basically aggressed by what looked, in fact, like this almost rabble of Scottish footmen, right? As opposed, of course, to the song narrating the deeds of the beautiful and powerful Norwegian knights. As opposed to that, of course, forces were relatively similar, but indeed there are some differences. We're not aware, for example, that Norway was fighting with, for example, more infantry than other places, because just like Scotland was sort of less socially stratified. So it's very interesting even there to evaluate how even actually similar all these countries were, even when they did differ substantially from other political and social points of view when it came to properly warfare. So in the armies of the Scottish kings, the collaboration between infantry and knights hinged largely on the infantry's strength. All right, this is something that in perspective you can see since Pictish times even. That was this sort of bulk of infantrymen constituting the main battle line, and the cavalry forces that in Scotland were always somehow consistent anyway. This is not like in Ireland, for example, where cavalry was something radically underdeveloped to the point of being barely identifiable as such. In Scotland, there was, for different reasons, there was some sort of early power concentration in some sort of feudal fashion that is different from the rest of the Celtic fringe, say Wales included. But these knights were still too few, especially consider that these kingdoms had been, the general countries had been growing. I made a video about Davidian Scotland. There is at times the development also of lots of the uncontrollable forces, like the freemen out there in the lowlands, in the highlands, even that increased in number, and the building actually a feudal hierarchy in that circumstance is a bit more complicated than it seems, because again, Scottish politics is really a mess. The English are basically the ones that are forging some sort of more concentrated power and or injecting that kind of, in fact, cooptative power to foster at least some greater control through a hopefully single monarchy that in this sense is easier to manipulate as an English client state, right? But in this sense, the Scottish knights are so few that still by the 13th century they do not make it, ever since like antiquity, to simply take over as the upper arm, right? It's not like these knights, as we will see, do not have a dynamic role, right? It's not like in the Flemish armies where there are literally just only infantrymen. But these knights typically guarded the flanks or served as a reserve rather than charging head down like their English counterparts that would have actually steamrolled them just if it had been a matter of numbers, right? The English had the best sort of Western Frankish style cavalry, a much more developed state and feudal system, etc. So, of course, they were much more updated. And again, the recent videos about English warfare and how they came, for example, to privilege dismounted men-at-arms and the role there, also the particular type of British infantry, the likely greater availability of archer as opposed to crossbow, really forged during the wars of Scottish independence. Really an important melange. Why? Because even though the English had a more advanced military system, the Scots were also fighting for their own independence. At least they wake up in the process, and they managed to stand their ground under some leaders that understood the potential that Scotland had as in fact, as an independent kingdom. That was, in hierarchical terms, the most difficult thing that the Scottish nobility had to digest, like conferring power to some sort of more central figure, that they have to cope themselves with the fact that the Scottish infantry is still infantry, so it's nothing special per se, lots of numbers and relatively few quality, at least in material terms, but they're still, in fact, angry, savage. Let's be honest, Scotland is not a civilized country, and as such, they know how to stand their ground and die, and to do so against the combined arms that the English enact, in fact, cavalry charges, arrows, volleys, and also other kind of heavy infantry, for example, in the process, right? So the Scots at times get defeated by the English. There is nothing deterministic about this. Even the single most famous battles, if you pick Bannockburn, etc., like the same. Before I mentioned Stirling Bridge, that basically is not an infantry victory, because basically the English are attacked while they're crossing the bridge of Stirling, and they get overwhelmed by Scottish numbers. But again, a couple of years before, like the English has exterminated an entire army of Scottish infantrymen. So there is nothing mechanistic in the way these things happen. It's mostly a political issue, like what the Scots began to understand and visualize and accept, right, as an option in all this, so that the English habituate themselves, because the Scottish are too many on foot, that their thickly packed charges, even though being very powerful and supported by auxiliary forces, could simply not break this bulkier infantry formations. And so at a point, they also dismount to take them on, and or at least have this practice, or more frequently doing so. Again, it's not like the English at some point in their history decided to simply dismount their men-at-arms for the sake of that. As I explained and repeated ad nauseam in the previous videos on the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, the English men-at-arms were perfectly capable of fighting on horseback, and they would have done it had they had, for example, the numerical advantage that the French had. Instead, most of the times that they fought against them in the war, there is just a matter of adaptation, habit, experience that bring the English to toy also with principles that evidently here also the Scots had. It's not like we remember the Scottish army as something particularly advanced in the history of the art of war. We just objectively recognize their moral force, and they became famous in the annals of military history essentially for this, because that's at the end of the day what warfare really is, right? But in that sense, there was nothing really revolutionary or innovative. The Scots fought like that just because they were backwards as hell, and if they had I don't know, the means the English had, they would have obviously fought with those as well. So that there is probably a functional standard in having a fully developed army that goes in a way or another. And of course, I don't want to sound too teleological either. In fact, this is not how they reason even in line of principle. Of course, again, primarily if you want to invest in an army or another, it's a political and social issue. It's not just a military one. There is no such thing here like probably a doctrinal tendency for which somebody was squeezing their brains at the table. How do we combine here the infantry and cavalry? They knew how to adapt to the circumstances, but of course, like in the Scottish case, for example, the availability of feudal knights was an issue to begin with, also internally to the system, and how, for example, the lowlands had tried to also assert their control over areas that had remained relatively peripheral, but doing this, in fact, at the expense of an increasing dependency from the English. I mean, at the expense of paying for that. And so that's actually the most interesting side of the story. For that matter, like a Scottish knight would have ideally thought to be, of course, like any other European knight, like having sort of a poor panoply on average, but at the end of the day, being within the same mindset. So we're not really looking at particularly distant cultures. Like we just mostly primitively assess the situation of the Celtic fringe as opposed to the much more developed England, but we're still talking about 13th century countries, so that they weren't light years apart in terms of civilizational development, right? So operating on the flanks as reserves, that's important. That's how you would, in fact, overall use knights in a situation like that, especially when the bulk of your line is constituted by, let's say, heavy infantry, yes, but not elite infantry like the men-at-arms, right? Because you would say, but then why didn't the English use, I don't know, cavalry on their flank? Sometimes they did, like with concealed reserves during the 100 Years' War, something like that, but their knights were in the center because they had lots of them, at least, and they could constitute that the battle line. The Scots didn't have most of the times something like that, and so naturally, like with the wars of Scottish independence, then the great crisis of the 14th century, also England shrinks her imperial ambitions in Britain. Scotland profited of this, so it became a more fully fledged, again, feudal kingdom in itself, and by the later Middle Ages, in fact, had somehow still, again, I made videos about the Scottish lowland pikemen for also Renaissance warfare, but tendentially, like, gaps are reduced, and also the art of war changes a little bit even in between. This fact, especially of dismounting, as we explained, wasn't much just a 100 Years' War thing. It's just part of a broader crisis of the later Middle Ages. Armies are smaller, thus terrain is more important, so different things happen on the field as well. But the essentials, the fundamentals, are not really brushed away. On the contrary, that, for example, the triple battle line, we've seen it very often in the Renaissance armies organic, basically still mirrors the top armies of the great medieval civilization of the 13th century, so early 14th one. So it's really in line with a great deal of continuity from the previous system, right? So within the English king's armies, instead, archers were entrusted, at least increasingly so, with independent roles targeting the flanks of opposing forces. as we were seeing just yesterday. This seems to have been a thing, at least compared to other armies of the time, like that still used very often also missile infantry, because heavy infantry was decaying by the mid-14th century, other than the nobility that, in fact, was also dismounting to partially compensate for that role. We don't have the proof that, in this sense, the English longbowmen's wings were particularly used in any particularly different way from the one that, I don't know, the Italians were using, or the same French, or any other. Like we've seen it with Spain at Battle of Rio Salado. We've seen this in like pretty much everywhere. Also, the point is very often that we're not told for certain areas of Europe much about how battles were really fought. If you look at, I don't know, Germany in the same period, it's very difficult to squeeze any kind of relevant information about, for example, infantry wings from the era. Likely it's not been properly studied yet, but and we know that they were there, but still some limit exists in the actual level of documentation. By the mid-14th century, Edward III, the greatest and most complete military genius in English history, managed to assemble substantial knightly forces, establishing a balance between cavalry and infantry. This is relevant because, as we explained in the videos about the 100 Years' War tactics, it's not just much about, again, any particular English tactic as innovative or different or whatever that really matters here, but how strong was Edward III's England from a political, institutional, social profile, how much work he had made, how much had also been started under Edward I, Edward II, in the development of the same English armies from the same campaigns, for example, against the Scots, as we just observed, just out of sheer practice. There wasn't even properly a reform at this point. Like medieval armies didn't really operate. For the Roman army, you can discern, even though at essentially hundreds of years of distance, some specific reforms that at least we call in this way, also probably for them in a quite approximate to categorical sense. For the Middle Ages, we don't talk much about this. Something similar would have occurred, but the practice seems at the end of the day so similar across different countries that, aside from the overall changes that occur across the board, and without even too many radical divides, at some point it's also homogeneous, especially by this point, that you can't really even point out too much. I guess we were just saying yesterday about the English longbowmen. The actual quality of the English armies resided, in fact, in their professionalism, in their experience, in the way they were commanded, really, by the leaders, their general political, strategic, moral purpose, a collapse in France, lots of riches there to wait for them. I mean, for example, putting together an army and going to fight into other countries seems pretty remunerative. In general, you don't have to pay the cost of their maintenance. You just will let the French pay for that. And again, so every context has its own specific logic. In any case, because of the aforementioned quality, the English developed a refined cooperative tactical framework on the basis of basically these two groups that, again, probably are also too sketchy in this sense: men-at-arms, and in fact other heavy infantrymen, and the English longbowmen. As we pointed out also in the video about the Battle of Poitiers, also many of the so-called English armies of the 100 Years' War are actually Anglo-Gascon, and the Gascons fought with the same, cavalry, heavy infantry, crossbowmen. So there wasn't just like, the Welsh, the stereotypical Welsh archer and the typical English men-at-arms in these battlefields. And in fact, there was a bit more pulp in between, also properly and likely from the English side, right? The indentures, just like the condotta, can be a bit tricky, because never think that a hiring contract is just indicative of the actual organic that was fielded by these, in fact, by the same contractors and their the leaders in the whole armies, right? So the key to battle reconstruction, to medieval warfare, is always and invariably the chronicles, narrative sources. Without those, you do not know how medieval armies fought, and there is no way around that, no way past that. Any other source is ipso facto secondary, all right? And as we were saying yesterday, by the way, regardless of the discrepancies that exist, obviously, between narrative sources, overall, what they say is pretty consistent, is pretty coherent, right? And you can definitely sort of put a lot of information together by making sense in a truly military logical fashion of these encounters. There is also in the English case a necessity for the archers to rely on the men-at-arms because they are light infantry. We explained that men-at-arms are heavy infantry or even heavy cavalry in some cases. In fact, there were also reserves of mounted knights and concealed reserves, etc. And again, we've seen it very beautifully at Poitiers with the book. Mostly just, however, the entire battle lines of cavalrymen are not the English thing in this period. And again, it's mostly due to the particular circumstances of these battles rather than a preconception against mounted fighting, or even just properly these English men-at-arms would have always been ready to fight in open ground, also with consistent formations, had they found the right tactical circumstances. And when you're heavily outnumbered, the best thing at that point is to dismount, to exploit the defensive, into which you're very often also cornered out of desperation, given the dire straits involved, and that's also what stimulates a bit of determination, given that either you fight or you die. And again, the battle of Poitiers was so beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful I've ever reconstructed. I really recommend the video they made because it's one of those that I'm the few ones I'm really proud of in general, and it speaks volumes about the entire context, politically, militarily, culturally, etc. There are also other minor encounters that are minor compared to the general circumstances, but of course we're talking about some thousands of men that in some circumstances, in some places especially, is definitely a lot, and mostly infantry, however, so that when we look at the knights involved, often there were just 1 to 5, for example, can be a normal proportion here. The Battle of Hausbergen, right? This offers a striking instance of foot soldiers succeeding. In fact, in 1262, Walter of Geroldsek, the Bishop of Strasbourg, came into conflict with the city's commune. I made a video about medieval Alsace, and we talked about this battle. And he gathers an army comprising 300 knights, and again, a considerable contingent of foot soldiers, some say 5,000, but as you understand here, that would have been actually above average in a sense. So you understand it's a relatively small battle, and smaller battles are the ones that were sort of the more random stuff tends to happen, so this is also a factor. However, before his infantry could reach the battlefield, the bishop moved to confront the communal army of Strasbourg and its allies. So the Strasbourg forces were led by 2 knights, the lords of Ochsenstein and Hohenstein, who arrived with their armored cavalry. The citizens had vowed to obey their commands unquestioningly. The 2 leaders decided to, which shows you, by the way, that the aforementioned synergy, also from a political, social, cultural point of view, of cavalry and infantry. And again, this is the traditional order of estates, of the castes, right? The knights are at the top because they lead these third estaters. Now, the 2 leaders decided to engage the bishop's mounted forces before his foot soldiers could join the fray. And to achieve this, they stationed 300 crossbowmen along the route the bishop's infantry would take, aiming to block their involvement in the battle. Half of the crossbowmen were instructed to fire as quickly as possible, while the other half reloaded for them, maintaining a relentless and effective stream of arrows. So this is a typically delaying tactic that cannot really hope to hold the entire infantry, but can, again, save enough time to stop it. And it's really incredible, by the way, that in this sense, you would imagine just a crossbowman being able to do so, because you don't really find similar stuff happening elsewhere. And this makes you question also the quality of infantry in absolute terms. In fact, the tactic succeeded in delaying the bishop's foot soldiers, wasting valuable time. Meanwhile, the two commanders, again, the lords of Oxenstein and Hohenstein, with their knights, launched an assault on the bishop's cavalry. So the Strasbourg communal army became embroiled in the close quarters combat typical of the circumstance. As the fighting intensified, Strasbourg's foot soldiers rapidly advanced, outflanking the bishop's mounted knights. This, as you understand, would have happened with actual, in between, like cavalry fights. So it's not merely just infantry that succeed on its own. It's something a bit more subsidiary as usual. And armed with pikes, they struck and brought down the horses of the Alsatian knights, causing the riders to fall with their mounts. Through this, the communal infantry bolstered their allies' assault and, capitalizing on their numerical advantage, clinched victory in the battle. So you see here again the typical subsidiary role. These guys swear allegiance to their noble commanders. They basically arrive. What is interesting here is that the same, not to waste time, because apparently the bishop had taken with him a lot of infantry. Cavalry engages first, right? So even just understand here the hierarchy of the situation. It's not like they were using infantry in any spearheading way. It happens that the Strasburgers arrive to support their own leaders that have actually engaged without infantry. And so overall, this doesn't even seem such an overwhelming proof of infantry independence. Again, this, for example, could not be indicated as an infantry victory, evidently enough. The best examples of infantry resilience really come from Italy, right? And these examples will be dealt with in depth in other videos, not just about the single battles, but probably the ones on Lombard infantry to core, because we are really witnessing the greatest development of infantry power in Europe in battles that, however, are, eloquent enough just to briefly repeat. For instance, in order, the Battle of Carcano, 1160. So at this point you have something very interesting, that is to say, cavalry, Lombard cavalry and infantry marching separated. Right. The reason why they would march separated in a strictly strategic sense, like as we've seen here also in the recent battle, is that yes, there would be some kind of divide between the cavalry and the infantry. Right. Alsace, for example, is generally speaking a feudal country. It has these communal towns that offer, as we've seen, this infantry support. Italy is a bit different because it has something that is tendentially heading towards a more unitary style government in the city, but there are struggles, as we were saying before, between the milites and the pedites as far as their, especially the latter's, political reivindications. It would be interesting to see literally how Envu led especially the infantry part. What happens is that Lombard infantry is met by imperial cavalry and broken, right? So at that point, normally when an infantry is broken in a battle, like you don't have things like they're broken, all right? They're retreating, they're withdrawing, they're done for, right? What happens is that imperial cavalry proceeds further and engages Lombard cavalry. That is also broken. This tells you, by the way, how powerful that imperial cavalry really was. These were mostly Germans and other Italians. So in the meanwhile, the Lombard infantry that had been broken actually gathers, like comes back into, really reunites, redraws in to the line. And while this other engagement was going on elsewhere, they march up to the imperial camp and they sack it. And they come back home eventually without, say, aside from the hits that they had taken from the first attack, they come back home with loot and whatever. And you see the two also, it's not like the imperial cavalry comes back and deals with that. I mean, this battlefield is extended for kilometers. There is a time there. There is also the course of the day. So that's how it went. But there you have basically infantry operating on their own terms, on their own, and even having this incredible capacity of coming back together as a functional battle line after having been broken by cavalry, by the way. So it's really remarkable. The Battle of Legnano is also very famous. I'm not even going to simply descend on this. We just remember that essentially Lombards are abandoned by their own cavalry, and they withstand the imperial cavalry charges gathered around their carroccio and protected by a ditch or something. Then basically some Brescian, this were the Milanese, and the Brescians arrive they regather back some Milanese cavalry, but they arrive from another side, right? Because they literally arrive from Brescia. These are different towns, different cities that basically sent these reinforcements in the moment, as they know that Frederick Barbarossa is crossing the Milanese territory, because here the Lombards had come to intercept him strategically. And they attack from the flank. As you know, the imperial army is annihilated, and in the process, by the way, the Lombard infantry, while the enemy is being attacked from the side, attacks from the front, leaves the ditches, surpasses them, and enters the fray properly in attacking the enemy knights, the Ghibelline knights. That example is also very remarkable. The strongest one, there are others, right? For example, in this sense, there's the Battle of Cortenuova that shows probably an even sturdier resistance from the side of the Lombards against Frederick II, but they don't go anywhere. On the contrary, at night, having managed to maintain the field, they flee it with the cover of darkness, and so they save their skins. But the top achieved in that sense by infantry alone, Lombard performance, and this is very important in the history of the Western art of war, not just the Italian one, we'll explain now why, is occurring at Fossalta, 1249, near Bologna. And this basically this Bolognese army crosses the Panno River to attack the imperial troops commanded by Heinz of Sardinia, right, the son of Frederick II. And actually, infantry at this point crosses the river alone to face the entire, imperial cavalry and infantry combined. They were so eager, the Bolognese were so eager, in fact, they would maintain such an enormous popular force later on, to come to grips with the Ghibellines, that they do not, as infantrymen, even stop to wait the cavalry. They don't march together. They cross the river, so they put themselves basically against the enemy and with the river behind, so potentially not even having much chance of escape if things had gone wrong. This tells you what kind of courage, what kind of determination, more or less, and vision they really had. And they, you see, this is not an infantry victory either, because they actually, they get reached eventually by their cavalry that wins the day, basically. And as you know, Heinz is captured, is imprisoned in Bologna, etc. It's a bit like the tragedy of the Hohenstaufen, like how they went one by one in the end. And but this is the peak, let's say, in which I would say in European warfare before the phase of the early 14th century, which infantry basically goes out there alone with an aggressive intent, right, to face a combined arm force in open field without actual support of any natural or artificial obstacle that we know of. So this is utterly insane, but they actually do it because they were so driven. And again, it's about moral force. And in the end, the same Bolognese win together, but again, with their own cavalry. And that's the most important thing. Why is this important? Because eventually the Italians will surpass this rivalry with the say the Peditas. The Italian Peditas will surpass this rivalry with their own militas, and with the city-states fully fledged in the second half of the 13th century, cavalry and infantry will fully integrate, and so they will actually have the best armies probably of medieval Europe that nobody talks about, that are actually very potently cavalry dominated, and but also having at the same time, in absolute terms, the strongest infantry out there, with wings of armies. We're talking armies of 30,000 with 3 lines in depth, with wings of 5,000 infantry each. Compare it to the numbers of single, I don't know, Swiss armies in the Renaissance. These armies were utterly insane, were something utterly enormous, and completely capable of performing, by the way, combined armed tactics with these massive wings composed of, in large part, by pikemen, by the way, able to basically outflank the enemy once, of course, the respective infantries, because they mostly fought among Italians that had the same kind of armies, to take out that line. And what is interesting, by the way, is that aside from the wars of the Lombard League, the latter part of Italian history does not witness any major battle with any foreigner. In part also because, as we've seen in many videos, central northern Italy were so pretty darn tough to crack to begin with. I mean, the Lombard Leagues had proven that. And so paradoxically, we have this situation where it's not like there aren't foreign expeditions. Think about Henry VII is the biggest one, aside from the fact that he also had, say, lots of Italians in his ranks as well. But in this sense, we don't have a term of comparison so that we think, look at the battles of the Lombard League, especially because of 19th century history. It's so cool because it's like, Italians versus Germans, right? First of all, it's not technically Italian. That's not really what happened, right? They were mostly, again, it's a feudal clash. The Lombards thought to be proud imperial subjects, that they were okay with the Germanic emperors in line of principle. They didn't like certain measures and government, and the Germanic emperors fought with other Lombards on their side, so it's not much of a national issue. There is also that in part, right? But since later on there wasn't this national clash, and the Italians were on their own, basically you have everybody singing, again, the Flemish armies of Courtrai, not, for example, the Italians that are sent there by Philip IV as soon as the massacre of the Golden Spurs occurred, that managed to actually even keep, like in numerical inferiority, but with great tactical performance, to keep at bay the same victors of the battles of the Golden Spurs, in that at large had, again, the largest armies and the richest states out there. The Neapolitans too basically had the same type of armies, but since they're more feudal, they're less documented, and so we haven't even taken that into adequate consideration. This is true, as I was saying before, a bit for the rest of Europe, but we know that these regions were the ones where there were the biggest armies, the greatest collective training, the greater spread of professionalism, etc. So we're looking really at very intense situations where, especially as I was saying at the beginning of the video, the level of flawlessness, right? The fact that all these armies were basically competent and they fought with an incredible, not just they were big, right? But they were very well coordinated. They had excellent combined arms tactics, but they were so homogeneous. Right, they were also largely coalition forces, and this tells you how habituated to fight, what kind of old level of cooperation, even of leagues within cities, etc., had existed in these regions forever and ever. It's been recognized that basically Italy was the most belligerent country of the period, and this also is produced in the it's to be read, to be seen in the very armies that they fielded. All right, this is again incredibly important because nobody tells the story. It's not like nobody tells the story, right? Nobody tells the story. You can argue that, yes, also in terms of righteousness, nobody tells you normally what I'm talking about today, and all this various sort of divides between the various regions, the timings, why this stuff was happening, etc. But it's just like there's some stuff that is not even documented, that is not even discussed, historiographically speaking, right? And again, I could talk for hours about this because I can't say that I'm basically just specializing in this stuff. I started especially with infantry, like honestly, like my bachelor and my master were okay, but I can say they don't count because they counted for some, especially the latter was on the Battle of Markfeld. It is a typically feudal battle, and it's so very, indicative, in fact, of that way to war. However, my doctorate was a much more powerful insight in actual infantry warfare because I started from that. I was inspired by, I can say it, that because eventually I came to hotly criticize him by De Vries, that at least in his PhD thesis that was eventually published as a work, as the infantry warfare in the early 14th century, whatever it was, the name it was, made something that I wanted to do, and that instead I came to overly surpass in everything, and ever since I in fact changed my ideas on the quality of that work. But that, for example, remains, like if you're studying today, like the topic, basically together with Verbruggen, that was actually a much better historian and an excellent one in many ways, but that also hadn't studied all of European history. Like this was a Belgian scholar that placed a lot of importance, for example, in the Flemish armies, right? He recognized, for example, the importance of the Italian ones, but he hadn't really studied them so much. So he knew much better, like full feudal era English, Flemish, French warfare, some German one, but already, for example, like, I don't know, 14th century German warfare, so less. The same goes for the Italian. Also, the Spanish is almost non-existent, or at least if not, again, mostly from the 11th to the 13th century. But honestly, Verbruggen is my favorite. Historian of medieval warfare. I think I can't say maybe in absolute terms, but let's say in the range of the last generations, I think he set some standards in which years were they were the 1950s that eventually resonated, and nobody was able to simply replicate, because they were a bit an in-between time between, in fact, some more like people really studied everything. You can really see in Verbruggen how much he studied, for example, like medieval literature, right? That's something that contemporary scholarship does not have anymore. Really, they just go bit by bit and just, again, in their narrow confines. And at the same time, how rigorous and sort of logical, when not rational, maybe too much rational, he was when analyzing, in fact, battles, clashes of all kind. And he had a very clear, I don't remember whether he had a military background himself, but I mean, he reasoned very much with a military lens himself, right? Which is something that I also strive to. I spent some time in a military academy, big. It's not a spoiler, it's not a surprise, but I'm not a military man, and I didn't become one. So the importance in assessing these differences, in assessing these episodes, and being able to recognize what they really mean, I think, in my opinion, is so crucial for anyone to be an expert in the medieval art of war. Excuse me, drink a little. There is indeed a lot that still requires a great attention. That is, again, it's been abandoned just by, I don't know how many people have done what Verbruggen did. It's not that Verbruggen even published like an infinite amount of work on this stuff, right? So De Vries, there are some names. What's the name finishing in Bach? Well, I don't remember now, but I mean, there are a few Bach, actually, right? That's another important name. That, for example, that guy was so more cursory in general, and he he covers much different stuff. But you see, his interest was more peregrine and somehow more. Let's talk about this topic because the topic is cool, right? Fulk of Nera, the Angevins, some German stuff, the Ottonians, right? So, in any case, indeed, it takes time. It takes a long time. I know it's difficult also in life to get that time. I fortunately have enough time so far, but you may never know what happens because there may be really a lot of just difficulties spawning happening, and believe me, it's not easy. Even to run Schwerpunkt is a challenge. I mean, it must be a challenge first of all, but it's something that I feel grateful for because it's not like I leave simply doing everything I want or live exactly the way I want all the time. Right? There are always stupid reasons for which annoying. I hate noises, for example. You would say, but these are your problems. Well, not all it are. There's all the existential angst and other stuff. But say so there are things, even stupid things, that can sort of get in the way. And honestly, I encourage you never to lose faith, never to lose hope, because at the end of the day, you are really, you are the one who makes the difference. And sometimes in life, it does get lonely, mostly due to things that really happen around with simple goodbyes or, even more dramatic things. But let's say there's a part of us that really feels divine. It really calls you to action, to be to be more responsible in a way or another. And I think that there is such an important way of seeing things that it would be better browsed. What else to say? Well, again, anecdotes mostly, because when you talk about this stuff, again, everything gets down to also how many examples you can bring to the table. But again, remember what we say about warfare, what we say in general about the broader importance of assessing infantry value, right? Because that is the key. Because you know why? Because in Western warfare, at the end of the day, heavy cavalry was all alike. All right. Yes, there were, I don't know, here and there mounted crossbow, even mounted bowmen, lighter types of horses. But in general, that sort of, especially towards the 13th century, even the differences between this type of, especially the shock cavalry, had sort of ended. Like, it wasn't much just the squire following with a round scene. Like, even the servientes were fundamentally as well armored as their lords, right? So that remains a factor. And there are differences also across Europe in terms of who knights are, a bit mostly from their background, but it doesn't change much, all right? They are pretty much the same. The infantry, you could say, ideally, like, also was basically the same. But at the same time, it's essentially more variable especially in relation to cavalry, right? Because they really, as we've seen, depended on that cavalry, right? So it's somehow even conceptually tricky, at least if you're not particularly into this kind of, not of sophistry, but indeed some kind of broader attention to details. Nevertheless, the stuff is there. The history is real, and that's always a good reason to study it, right? I would like Schwerpunkt to be much more than this. I would like Schwerpunkt to really take off, not just to talk about the technicalities of warfare, but this is not just what I do. It's also, again, it's basically my own avenue for starting to talk about the details of lots of other stuff, right? And military history is so random at times. I mean, it teaches you things that you would have never imagined it could teach you in ways that are really amazing, that you wouldn't really and simply expect so easily as other things. So yeah, in my opinion, there is a great deal of unseen, still of unstudied, and I hope the Schwerpunkt in his say its broader meaning and possibility to divulge information will at least take a step further, because we're not really in a bad place, but I wish this channel really took off. Like at this point, I don't really hide the fact that it's not just about, of course, like the material advantage that it could derive from this and the opportunities, etc. But it's really like, I don't know at this point in history, like of the channel, like how this is even going to be seen, right? Having made all this work, I thought that the more I went on, that this would be some sort of incremental, say directly incremental. But I'm talking myself. I can never say. Remember, there was never an increase, a linear increase in infantry development. Well, so also Schwerpunkt follows this trend. But in more concrete terms, not really. I mean, I have this very weird thing here that basically I get more views than other channels, but say in relative terms. But for the watch length, okay, my videos are longer, but in general, like I'm good. Like my rate of income of watch length because it's all calibrated in relative terms to the type of video that you send, right? It's actually pretty good, but for some reason, the content itself is not exposed. It's not really suggested the way other stuff is, and so this is, let's say, if you really are interested in medieval warfare, I can tell you that regardless of my format, of how boring I can be, that can maybe the reason behind it, this all, I don't know, but there is definitely this is really good stuff. Like, at least this is stuff that you don't find discussed elsewhere, and that is actually pretty relevant in strictly military historical terms. So again, if you really, obviously I'm self-propagandizing here, but it's not without a reason. Like, this is recognizably, I would say, some of the best stuff you can't really get, right? On these kind of subjects. Overall, however, again, we have to cope with the realization that, of course, we're not at the top, and that we may get at some point, and probably, like, this channel would never be at the top, but were we, I don't know, just 4 times what we are, we would really have such a great time in more than we could imagine, right? So I don't know, in the past years I was more motivated. This year, I don't know, there were numbers of reasons that sort of recently have brought me a bit down. I confess this in my private life. And they're not major delusions or anything. It just changes, right? And when you change, you don't really know sometimes how things go. So that's mostly the same old reason, like fearing stuff that is not even there yet, or at least that you can't predict being there yet, but having to cope with it. And it's been also several years that have been going on with this, so that's a factor. But perhaps these topics are better left for a broader discussion in the spring update that at some point we'll have to make. In any case, it doesn't really cost anything, right, to make these additions, especially at the end of the video after I discussed all the topic. And so I don't plan to exhaust any of my content, of my material. This is also something I can easily sort of provide. I would say that there is always some kind of let's say that there is always a next video that I can make, but again, there must be also certain conditions to be met for me to actually make the video, because preparing them is something, but eventually making the videos, it's not too easy. Some videos are easy. This one was easy, for example. Others are not easy, right? Others are sort of more complicated, and in general they hide a bit more of issues, and because they're complex, they're bigger, you have to talk more about them, and so it's always in some ways about this. But I really appreciate your support. I really appreciate any like really what you have proven me like throughout all these years, that is a great consistency, one that I couldn't and wouldn't, of course, ever forget or dismiss or complain about, because really this channel is of course I am maybe the soul of the channel, in the sense that I'm the one that sets the direction, the standard, the form, but this channel is also about you. It's also you. It's also what you do, right? So without that, we wouldn't really have what we would more conventionally think of this all. And I think that there is some good in it. I think that truly this is not, I mean, all the things I could do in my life, I could have not done this. I could have, like, all the energy I placed on Schwerpunkt could have been really invested elsewhere. This is something I think about every day, because when you start taking these paths, like at some point you also have to be consistent, also to be honest about whether something went the way you wanted or not, or whatever. And so it really makes you think. And so I very much appreciate that you stuck with me, and that you found the, let's say, the time and the interest of appreciating my work, of sort of being here. And I really hope that maybe this is 5 years ago I had different ideas of how things would go, but I still believe in this, and I will be, if anything, more open, more vocal about this in some other moments, in some other circumstances. All right. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.